Hi everyone, welcome to the 8th week of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich. At this point, we are now about halfway through the summer term, and we have essentially covered the most essential aspects of phonological analysis in having discussed procedures of phonemic analysis, learning to formulate phonological rules using a system of phonological features that is able to pick out natural classes, and to apply techniques of morphophonemic analysis in order to account for patterns of allomorphy in languages. That is essentially trying to explain alternations in the form of morphemes by reference to phonological rules. In the second half of this course, we will move to some more specialized topics and problems that also look beyond the level of the segment. Thus far, we've mostly talked about phonological processes that affect individual sounds that we can represent with symbols that correspond to some place and manner of articulation in the International Phonetic Alphabet. But as we go on, we'll look more at so-called prosodic phenomena, that is phonological phenomena above the level of the segment. And we will also look at interactions we've already seen extensive interactions between phonology and morphology, but we'll also look at the interaction between phonology and syntax as well. The topic for this week is productivity, and for today, you should have read chapter 9 of Hayes' textbook. Next week, we're going to try to catch up a little bit in topics and compress what was originally intended for weeks 9 and 10 into 1 week. This week, the third homework assignment is due on Wednesday before the exercise session for the Übung. In a couple more weeks, the fourth homework assignment will be uploaded. So let's begin today. And we'll begin just with a basic definition of this notion of productivity as specifically applies to phonological processes. So I will call productivity the propensity of a phonological process to apply to a novel form. That is, essentially we're saying if a phonological process is productive, it should be able to be applied to a new word, a new form that the speaker has never produced before. So the relevant question, the essential question here is, when a speaker has to produce some form that he or she has never produced before, and assuming that the form indeed contains the relevant target that can undergo some rule and the context for that rule, does the rule actually apply? And it might seem obvious at first to think, yes, if a language has the phonological rule that we phonologists have discovered, then of course it should be applied. But this is not quite so simple, and as we'll see, sometimes there are it may look to, from our perspective as phonologists, as linguists, that a language might have some phonological process, but it could turn out that it's not a psychologically real process for the speakers. Maybe that can sometimes be an indication that historically there used to be some phonological process which linguists can still recognize the remnants of in certain words in the language, but if speakers don't seem to use this rule in on new words, in new phrases, then we can't consider it a productive process any longer. This term productivity, you may hear it more commonly in the domains of morphology and syntax, and especially with respect to morphology, the topic of productivity has been investigated, has been the topic of an extensive amount of investigation. And at those two levels, the morphological and syntactic levels, it's relatively straightforward and clear to see when we find newly built words or newly built phrases that depend upon the productive application of morphological or syntactic processes. So for instance, in English, there's a suffix spelled with the letter Y, pronounced E, which is used for deriving adjectives from nouns. So for instance, from the noun frog, we can derive the noun froggy, meaning that something has some characteristics of being like a frog. And from adjectives, we can derive abstract nouns using the suffix ness. So from the adjective froggy, we can derive the noun ness, meaning something like the quality of having frog-like aspects. And in English, the verb give constitutes a so-called ditransitive verb, and with that we can productively build so-called ditransitive constructions in which we have a verb, and in English there are two possibilities in this ditransitive construction, whereby we can either have two noun phrases or a verb and a noun phrase and a prepositional phrase headed by the preposition to. So for instance, one could say the llama gave the kangaroo 12 sheep, or the llama gave 12 sheep to the kangaroo. Haven't tried to look to see if these are sentences that anyone else has ever put together before, but the exact combination of these lexical items, llama, kangaroo, a noun phrase 12 sheep, makes me think this is probably not a phrase I had thought of before, so we would consider this to be instances of productively built phrases. And in German, we can see exactly the same thing. So we have if we take the etymologically parallel suffix ich in German, parallel to the suffix I in English, from the noun frosch, we can derive an adjective froschig. And an abstract forming noun kite can be used for building further nouns from adjectives. So from an adjective froschig, one could then productively build a noun froschigkeit, which my experience, having used this example in other courses, that native speakers of German are not likely to have encountered such a word before, but recognize it as a well-formed possible word. And that's precisely the point, that productive processes, whether in morphology, syntax, or phonology, make sense. They produce, excuse me, they produce outputs that are well-formed, but they generate forms that speakers might recognize that they've never seen before. And in a ditransitive construction in which we have, similarly in German, using the verb geben, give, we have one noun phrase in the dative and another noun phrase in the accusative, and we can have the parallel to the English here, das Lama gab dem Känguru 12 Schafe. Good. And interestingly, for both in the morphological and syntactic domains, there's been a good amount of research on also how to quantitatively, statistically measure the productivity of word formation and phrase construction processes in comparison to one another. So, for instance, in German, there are ways of forming abstract nouns with the suffix keit, or heit is the parallel suffix there. There's actually a phonological conditioning that seems to explain the distribution of those allomorphs. But there's also a suffix which often conditions umlaut of the base. So deriving words like Wärme or Kälte, for instance. And this abstract forming suffix is probably less productive, quantitatively speaking, than the suffixes keit and heit in German. More new words get built using this suffix, if we want to call it a single suffix, than with this suffix and on these topics in morphology and syntax, I can refer you to work of Harald Bayen and a book by Amir Tseldes. Now, returning to phonology, the question here is really whether a rule that we can infer from existing phonological data, so when we phonologists look at data and we can imagine a rule, we ask ourselves whether this rule will apply to new examples where, according to the rule, it ought to apply, where it is supposed to apply. Let's take an example here. So someone says to us in English, this is my friend Lok, and this is his brother Stephen. And you want to rephrase this as saying, this is this person's brother, Stephen. I think we would need to say this is Lok's brother, Stephen. The only possible way to realize the possessive, the Saxon genitive form here in English, is with a suffix s. So probably one would write this as something like, I don't know, Lok's, Lok's. But underlyingly, just like the plural, the noun plural building suffix that we've discussed, the underlying representation of this possessive suffix in English is z. It's completely homophonous and has allomorphs in the same distribution as the English plural building suffix. So for instance, to the noun Anna, in English, to build the possessive form, we would have Anna's with the suffix z, Anna's husband, for example. So the fact that we find an s here in this productively built instance of the plural suffix to a new name that we've never heard before, we see the operation of the process of obstruent devoicing that we've seen in English, that we've talked about before, whereby a sonorant, a non-sonorant consonant becomes voiceless, preceding a voiceless non-sonorant consonant. So with this new word lok, the possessive suffix, which has the underlying form z, so we can imagine this being having the underlying phonological form lok z, taking this suffix with this underlying phonological form from the morphology, and by the process of obstruent devoicing, we obtain loks. We obtain loks here in English. And I think there's an interesting further intuition that one can make here. This is my intuition anyway. Imagine that we had a name here with a voiceless uvular stop, ka. So the name lok, lok. And of course, no variety of English possesses uvular stops, as far as I know. But even in that case, my intuition is that if I have to produce the possessive form of a name lok, it would have to be loks. It can't have a voiced suffix z there. Saying loks is impossible by English phonology. So even if I try to have inputs that don't exist in any variety of English, if they conform to an existing natural class, that is, if they are non-sonorant, that is, if they are voiceless sonorants here, then they are going to condition the application of obstruent devoicing. So in phonology as a whole, as we'll see in this week and next week too, when we talk about variable phonological processes a bit more, I would say it's probably possible to divide up or differentiate processes into at least 5 different levels or types of productivity. So first, there are rules that always apply wherever their environment is met, regardless of whether there are word boundaries or syntactic boundaries. So next week, we'll discuss the topic of boundaries more. Then there are rules that always regular apply, but only within a specified domain. So there are rules that may apply within a word, but not beyond a word. So I'm going to let me invent an example here. Let's say we have a rule that changes S to a glottal fricative between 2 vowels. Let's say that a language has this rule. And let's invent some vocabulary items for the language. Let's say that this language has the word, the underlying form, asa. Let's say this is an allophonic rule, and a word, ama, or let's make it ima, for instance, and a word, kalus. Doesn't matter what these words mean. Now, in saying whether this rule is word bounded or not, we should see that if this rule is, so regardless, by this rule, we should expect to see its application inside this word tasa, and thereby generate taha. If the rule is word bounded, and let's say that it's possible to have a phrase in this language, kalus ima, if the rule is not is not word bounded, then by the application of this rule, we should generate the phrase kalu hima, right? But if the rule is word bounded and doesn't apply across words, then instead we would find kalusima. That is, the S would not become a glottal fricative between two vowels if there was a word boundary in between. Finish this list here. There are also rules that may have additional lexical or morphological restrictions where meeting the phonological conditions is necessary for the application of the rule, but it's not sufficient. We'll look at some cases like that today. And next week, we'll also see cases of rules that apply variably or probabilistically. So there, only the phonological environment is relevant, but sometimes the rule happens to apply and sometimes it doesn't. And it will turn out there are actually a lot of such processes in languages of the world. And finally, then, there are rules, as I've mentioned, that linguists might be able to infer from some data in the language, but which are never used productively by the speakers. And these probably reflect the historical residue of phonological processes that used to exist in an earlier phase of the language, but which speakers have no longer acquired. And this kind of situation, in which a rule has died out, so to say, we will discuss a bit more in a couple more weeks when we talk about the relationship between phonology and language change. Let's take a brief pause here before we come back to looking at the status of these different types of, or levels of productivity.